So in The Power of One, we've talked about following one and what that means to imitate spiritual maturity we see in people around us, and ultimately the life, the epitome of human life, which is the life of Jesus Christ. And then last week, we asked everybody to choose one. That is, to choose someone that you want to share the gospel with. And that may change because they may not want to hear it, but as we want to be intentional about that, and we want to understand that it is our mission, that as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ, His people, His community, we are to make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything, and that Jesus is alongside us in that. This week, we're asking you to pray for that one that you've chosen. So it's important that we've chosen that individual because we're building on that now, saying we want to pray for that person and we want to spend time intentionally on that individual and on aspects of their life that will allow us to take that message of salvation, of the gospel, to that person and obviously have it received. This week in your small group, before we do the next section, I'd like you to spend just a couple moments discussing that idea of choosing one and who that is, and then as a group, pray for one another and for those people that you want to reach out to. Then come back and we'll do the rest. So this week we're talking about prayer, and more the idea of intercessory prayer, interceding on behalf of somebody else, as opposed to spending all of my time with my particular needs. Right? As we do that, I think it's important to recognize the tension that we get when we talk about prayer. There's a wide spectrum of people's feelings about prayer and how it works, how it doesn't work. Is it more for God? Is it more for me? What are those different things? Prayer and praise are intertwined throughout all of the Psalms, and that shows us that it has to do with our approach to God, that we praise Him and do those things. But it also develops for us some areas of question. I think of Paul, who says, pray without ceasing. And then Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, don't just keep on babbling. So how do I balance those? What do I do with that? And isn't it interesting that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount starts with what not to do in prayer, which is kind of like, if you will, telling us that there's a way that we can abuse prayer, that we can be more about ourselves, maybe more self-fulfilling rather than God-honoring. And so that's probably a test, a check mark that we want to look at in our prayer life. Is my prayer life designed to honor God, or is it really more about all my needs and fulfilling all of my desires? And then I think there's tension when we look at James. James says that prayer is very powerful and that it's effective, and that the outcome of that is that people are healed or restored, that people are forgiven. Talks about Elijah and it raining for years or not raining for years. And as he does that, we're sitting there going, okay, so what if my prayer doesn't work like that? Then what? Because you see, James says the prayers of a righteous person. And so now all of a sudden I'm caught up with, is it my righteousness? Did I ask the wrong thing? Is this something that God can't handle? That's probably not it. What I do know is that I can't ask for anything so big that God can't handle it. But I could certainly ask for things that are outside of His will. I could certainly be asking about things that are important to my life, specifically to me, and not to the glory of His church. So there's tension. As we go through some of the questions this week, I want to be aware of that, and I want to be sensitive to the fact that we may all have a slightly different understanding of how prayer works in my life and in other people's lives. Some of us want to do that in group format. Some of us want to do that individually, that we want it to be very, very private. I encourage both. As we go through some of these things, I invite you to open up to some of the questions you have and some of the doubts that might create, and try to encourage one another so that we can pray for others in a very intentional, very regular, very methodical way, and that we can also do that very spontaneously when need be. Enjoy this week. This week in small group, I'd like you to, as a group, discuss your experiences with prayer, both answered and unanswered, how it works, how it makes you feel, those different types of things. And then, if you have experience with prayer, quote unquote, working, where you have answered prayer, where you feel that presence and that answer from God, discuss why is it so difficult for people to commit to a regular prayer time. So many people struggle with that. Talk about that in your group. As a group, turn to the book of James, chapter 5, and read verses 13 through 18. And talk about what that passage says and how we deal with it and what we think about it, how it makes you feel. He uses Elijah to demonstrate the effectiveness of prayer. How do we apply that in our lives today? As we talked about a little bit in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to talk about prayer, but he starts with what not to do. Turn to chapter 6 of Matthew and read verses 5 through 14. And then as a group, discuss why is it that Jesus would issue those warnings about prayer. And if we were to hear that same message today, what do you think he would be warning us about in our prayer lives? For your last passage today, turn to Psalm 66 and read verses 16 through 20. It's hopefully a beautiful passage about prayer, but it can also be a little bit unsettling. Discuss the different pieces of prayer and what that passage is saying, and then talk about whether that encourages you or unsettles you a little bit. Share that with the group. Hopefully, when you left Sunday morning, you felt encouraged. And hopefully tonight or today as you leave your small group, you will have that same feeling of encouragement that prayer is powerful and that we need to invest in that prayer for those people that we want to touch with the gospel. I would ask you, hold on to that feeling, hold on to that encouragement, and invest daily in that type of prayer on behalf of those that you want to share with.